Joining me in Other Voices this week is Bud Conrad. He's chief economist at Casey Research. And, Bud, you recently wrote a piece in one of your newsletters, Debt in the Driver's Seat. And I want to go to the first heading in that article. The budget reflects the state of the nation. And you have a graph here. U.S. government debt will explode. And then you also have another graph, U.S. actual deficit at a record that we have never seen before. So let's begin with that.
Well, the big thing that I start with, Jim, is that we have been expanding debt probably for 80 years, but let's start with 50 years going back to World War II, at levels that now have gotten to the point where we cannot sustain this. Private debt is contracting, starting to. People can't afford to take on more mortgages. Businesses are contracting. But the federal government debt, and that's more important for the future of our money and our monetary system, is literally exploding. This business of almost $2 trillion deficit, it'll probably come out of about $1.65 trillion this year, is not quite half of the total expenditure of the government of $4 trillion. And when you have that kind of deficit and start piling on the debt, people will lose faith in the dollar. We're seeing funny ramifications coming out of China, looking for perhaps using the special drawing rights from the International Monetary Fund as they're looking for a way to avoid holding so many dollars that are going to be melting assets in their hands. And once confidence is lost in the dollar, the future for the dollar itself is lost. I worry that the foreigners who have been buying much of our government debt aren't going to be able to buy this much as they have in the past. For the decade up through 2006, they bought almost all of our federal government debt with all our trade deficit surplus to them that they reinvested in our government debt. Well, they can't do that anymore. So that brings up, how are we going to fund the $2 trillion deficit? We're going to fund it by getting the Federal Reserve to come along, buy it up, and therefore monetize it. And that leads to, of course, inflation. And inflation is what will destroy the dollar. I think the government would like modest amounts of inflation. It's almost a policy of what the actions are taking. The problem is, once it gets started, that fire is hard to put out when you lose confidence in something that is as phony as our paper dollars. And that's why, in the long term, I think, and I mean this by several years, we get to a very untenable position with the amount of government debt and, in general, the overall debt of the country. So that's my big picture summary of what I worry about.
Well, you know, Bud, if you take a look at the U.S. government's financial statements they filed last October, and this reflects fiscal year 2008, they talk about $63 trillion present value of unfunded Social Security and Medicare policies. And that, John Williams estimates, it could be $8 to $9 trillion this year, in addition to the formal budget deficit that you're talking about at $1.65 trillion. In your article, you talk about federal taxes. Federal taxes will be roughly about $2.1 trillion in 2009. How do we pay not only for our existing unfunded liabilities, 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, plus the largest retirement population in this country's history, heading into retirement, drawing on Social Security and Medicare in the next decade? If we're running, let's say, $1.6 trillion in deficits, and Obama just raised the budget deficit estimates by another $2 trillion over the next decade, but I see the only route out of this, the deflationists think that they'll never do this, but how can you fund, let's round it off, $2 trillion of regular operating deficits with $5 to $6 trillion of unfunded future deficits?
Yeah, the future deficits, those discounted cash flow present-day value of the retirement baby boomers, you started out with like $63 trillion. That's a really impossible nut to break. And no one even wants to know how to try and fix it. When you look at the shorter term, which is what I was starting with, how do you fund the $2 trillion deficit in the given year or so? The answer becomes you eventually create the inflation, that is, create more money, and that becomes money which is inflated. And then, therefore, the purchasing power of all money decreases. Therefore, people with savings accounts or retirement fixed income lose rather dramatically because their dollars won't purchase as much. But the alternatives are even worse. That is to try and defend the currency and when we have gotten so far off a center of how this could work out. You would also just collapse the economy so dramatically that nothing would work, and you'd have another absolutely worse mess. So the situation here, I don't believe the deflationary story, which I understand how it is happening. We're in a terrible recession. But the deflation will not be with us long, is my conclusion out of that. And I think you stated it beautifully, saying, look, we've got wars in Iraq, we've got health care programs. The government attitudes are, we don't have a problem, we can spend anything we want to. And the reality is, we, meaning you and me, who are taxpayers, have a huge problem either paying the taxes or dealing with the terrible inflationary aspects that are, I think, inevitable now.